they weren't playing really well, the Timberwolves, but we did see last year with the happy Jimmy Butler, they were obviously a playoff team. So I think, it's teams like San Antonio, teams like the Clippers, teams like
the Jazz and the Lakers.
Jazz, the Lakers, the Thunder. All these teams are going to be fighting for like 8 spots out of 10 teams that are now fighting, now it's 8 out of 10 instead of 8 out of 11. So I think those are some winners. I think, obviously, I think Jimmy Butler here is the winner because he gets what he wanted. He goes to play for a contender. Now, none of these teams were the teams he put on his list. But, this is a pretty big market with 2 pretty good stars that both play hard. I do think that the fit with Jimmy Butler, at least there, Jimmy Butler's going to like both these players because they're both good players who work hard. I don't think he's going to go down and dog them like he did with Cat and Andrew Wiggins, who probably deserve to get a dog like that because they just haven't been as hardworking players.
Those were your winners, right?
Yes.
And then how about your losers?
Well, of course, Tom Thibodeau's a loser, but he's been a loser for quite a while. He gets 2 players out of this. None of them are that great. I think, maybe the losers would be a team like the Celtics who are struggling right now, who already had to worry about Toronto and Milwaukee, and now are going to have to really worry about the Philadelphia 76ers as well. They play 4 games against them every year, and now it's just going to make their schedule harder. We all thought that Celtics are going to come in and have this great record, but we realize now that it's hard to win games in the NBA with a team that's first kind of getting used to playing with each other. So I do think that they're one of the losers in this deal.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the Celtics. I'm pushing it here with the Celtics being a winner, and the reason why I have them a winner, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is that the LA Clippers, if the LA Clippers make the playoffs, essentially the Celtics get their first round pick this year. And the good thing would be if the Clippers make the playoffs, they'll probably make it as a 7-8 seed, and the Celtics would literally just add another first-round pick to their slew of first-round picks that they'll probably have next year. And it would be a fairly nice, a near lottery pick, and therefore I have the Celtics winner in that sense. Now, for the losers, I'm glad you mentioned Milwaukee and Indiana. You mentioned Milwaukee, but I'm going to mention Indiana as well. Those are 2 teams that were probably hoping to at least sneak into the Eastern Conference Finals, and it just became a lot harder for them. And I'm not naming the Celtics and the Raptors here just because I do think the Celtics and the Raptors will ultimately end up in the Eastern Conference Finals. Like you said, the Celtics are struggling. I don't envision that continuing. I do see those 2 teams this year ending up in the Eastern Conference Finals, so I will not name them as losers, even though they might end up being big losers if Philadelphia knocks one of them out in the second round. If both of them advance. And another loser that I had on my list was the current Houston team because... And I know you said before, Daryl Morey is not a dumb GM, and he's not. Because regardless of what would have happened, he would have gotten a fantastic player to add to his roster, which he's desperate for a championship. I don't blame him. This is his window for a championship. I think he comes out a huge loser here. Even if he was to give 4 first-round picks for Jimmy Butler, he would be adding a superstar, an all-star, and a superstar to his roster, essentially for nothing in terms of them getting rid of anything this year. This is their window for a championship. I would not blame him for trading 4 first-round picks, at least not right now, because this is his window for a championship. Now, for my winners, real quick, Houston's future. Houston's future is a big winner here because they did not just give up 4 first-round picks. So I have Houston's present team as a big loser and Houston's future as a big winner. And like I said, the Celtics are a winner here because now if the Clippers are able to sneak into that playoffs, and Memphis remains out of essentially the top 10 in terms of teams. If Memphis is anywhere between, I don't envision Memphis making the playoffs, but I do see them coming out as like a 9th or a 10th seed. And if that so happens to be, and they don't make it into the top 8 of the lottery, the Celtics will have Sacramento's pick. They'll have their own pick. They'll have Memphis. And if the Clippers can make the playoffs, the Clippers pick. So the Celtics could potentially have 4 first-round picks in the draft coming up, and that is something to kind of keep an eye on and look forward to, even though everyone might not be doing that.
Okay, so now let's jump into, I have a few trade ideas. I do think that the Philadelphia 76ers are pretty much one pretty good player away. Now, I'll just mention this that the 76ers have really screwed up the past few drafts. I mean, I believe last year when they drafted Mikal Bridges, and then they ended up who was a 3-year player, right? 3-year player in college who won 2 national championships. He was ready to contribute in the NBA, and they traded away him for a deal that might in the future end up being a way better deal because they get an unprotected 2021 Miami Heat pick. But they traded away from Zaire Smith, who was much younger, who has some potential, but who can't really contribute in the NBA now. And I think Mikal Bridges being part of the 76ers off the bench would be a good player to come off the bench. And now, obviously, we know how they messed up the Marco Fultz deal, which really did hinder them. And at most, it gave up that pick they had that, could turn out. I mean, obviously, the Kings are playing pretty well right now, but I do see them not making the playoffs. And eventually, that's going to become some sort of lottery pick for next year. So, anyway, I do think that the Philadelphia 76ers have to make another trade, and I think the only trade chip they have right now is Markel Fultz. Now, obviously, they have Wilson Chandler, who's a salary filler, who's on a 1-year deal, which I think is important when we discuss this trade talks.
Yeah, I mean, and plus, they do still have Miami's 2021 pick, like you mentioned. They have their own first-round pick. I think they're a little skeptical about trading that pick just because if Sacramento's pick essentially ends up being the first pick, that one Philly will get that one, and Boston would then in turn get Philly's pick. It's extremely confusing, but essentially Boston owns the right to Sacramento's pick unless it becomes a number 1 pick. Then Philly keeps it and hands over their own first rounder to Boston. So I think they're a little skeptical about including that pick into any trade. But like you said, I mean, I don't think Elton Brand is not naive enough to believe that his championship window is 10 years long. He sees his championship window being between 2 or 3 years. If it's longer, great, but he's looking at it as win now, proven by this Jimmy Butler trade. So they have other assets. Landry Shamet, their later first-round pick from this past draft, is playing pretty well. He's been able to shoot the ball pretty well. I mean, potentially JJ Redick could be a trade chip, even though it would be kind of hard to see the Sixers trading him unless provided with a fantastic offer that they have to involve him in terms of salary fill. But like you said, Tyson, I mean, Wilson Chandler's there for that.
Yeah, I mean, JJ Redick, of course, has really, I really like his game with Joel Embiid. I like that they run the screen and the play where he makes the pass. So I don't think JJ Redick would be in the deal. So I'm just going to jump into the trade. The first proposed trade I have is the Markel Fultz, Wilson Chandler, and Jonah Bolden being traded for James Johnson and Kelly Olynyk from the Heat. Now, the reason why I think this trade is good for the Philadelphia 76ers is it gives them 2 players who can stretch the floor a little bit more than Fultz and Chandler. Johnson's a good defender. Olynyk's a good scorer. Obviously these 2 players are on 3-year deals, so it's kind of going to add you 2 players for the next 3 years where you're not going to have a lot of salary cap space, but you are going to be able to, you will be able to pay these players because they'll be on your team. Now, Wilson Chandler this year has an expiring contract. Marco Fultz has obviously 3 more years of the deal. But, if you're Miami, adding Marco Fultz might be a risk we're willing to take. Now, obviously, he straight out pretty much sucks this year. But other than his shooting, he's still playing hard. He's a big guy. He can play defense. He rebounds. So, there's still some potential there. And then maybe if he can, in 2 or 3 years figure out his shot, he might be a potential person that, that Miami's willing to take a risk here.
So, I don't know. I like Olynyk. I like James Johnson. I mean, they'd be solid role players for this team. They definitely help them win now. I think the problem here lies in the fact that as of right now, even if the Sixers re-sign Jimmy Butler for the full max, which is totally expected, they still will have over $20 million to spend on some free agents. Now, again, we learned last year it's hard to sign top free agents, but you could spend $20 million, either spend that and get a player like Tobias Harris, who would really help them in terms of their shooting problems, and he fits their timeline. Or you could sign a couple players for $10 million, like Tyreek Evans and someone else, one of the Morris brothers, Marquis for Marcus, and Marcus has been playing really well. for $10 million each and bring those guys in even a little more because they should have about $22-23 million available. Bring those two players. So again, and I think another thing with James Johnson and Kelly Olynyk, who again both are very good players in terms of doing kind of the X factors. Both are a little. I mean, James Johnson is a huge junkyard dog, picks up the trash. He actually passes the ball pretty well, plays solid defense, and so is Olynyk. But I think those are the type of players you could find in the buyout market once teams start buying out their players after the trade deadline. And it's kind of hard to mortgage that $22 million in cap space for two players, for two solid role players. So I would like the fit for that. I would like that trade for this year, but not for next year or 2 years.
That, of course, is a trade that is a win-now trade, and I think even for this year and next year, it does kind of help them out because I don't know if Tobias Harris, I think, the Clippers are going to, have potential to sign a Kawhi Leonard or Kevin Durant. And if they would do that, I think they would offer Tobias Harris, the rest of the salary that they have left because he's having a good year. And he's playing well, and I think that Tobias Harris and Kawhi Leonard or Tobias Harris and Kevin Durant could be a pretty good starter for the Clippers. Especially, and then if the Clippers strike out, I'm sure they're all going to offer more money to Harris than the Philadelphia 76ers will be able to.
Of course.
Anyway, so the second trade I have, now I'm not going to talk about the Philadelphia, I'll just mention the Philadelphia players because they don't really change. I have Wilson Chandler and Markelle Fultz being traded to the Dallas Mavericks for Harrison Barnes. Now, I know Harrison Barnes is having a pretty bad season so far this year. His shooting percentage is nowhere where it has been, at the three-point line at like 37%. But Harrison Barnes is a player that has obviously won a championship. He has playoff experience. He is still, 27, 28 years old, so he's relatively young. He's a proven NBA player who has some defensive potential. And I think the fit with starting lineup with Embiid, Barnes, Butler, Redick, and Simmons would be a pretty interesting lineup that would be hard to beat. What is your thoughts on this trade?
So again, I mean, you're essentially limiting your cap space here next summer. Now, I don't know. Harrison Barnes, he's 26, so he's a little younger than you mentioned, which is good. I mean, which fits the Sixers timeline a little bit more. But I'm not a fan because I don't think he's not an efficient shooter. He's a high volume scorer. He's not an efficient shooter. And you mentioned the struggles, but I think even last year he was an average shooter. And I think the Sixers need someone who is more of a good shooter as compared to just an average shooter. So will improve. Would it improve the team? Yes, I think it would improve the team. I'm not sure how much it would improve the team, and I would rather hold on in this type of situation. I would rather hold on to Markelle Fultz and see what could happen, and if not, try to trade him next in the offseason, see what you could get for him. And here's another quick thing. Now, I mean, I real quick in between your trade offers, I'm gonna throw one that potentially could happen next summer. Now, you're gonna think I'm crazy. And
here comes the Andre Drummond deal.
No. It would involve a lot of circumstances. But now, taking into consideration that if Zaire Smith, Markelle Fultz, and perhaps a TJ McConnell, let's say they find a way to trade them and not acquire any additional salary, that would open up another spot for a max salary contract. So let's say Klay Thompson, for some reason, which I don't see happening, and this is the big if, let's say Klay Thompson decides, hey, you know what, I want to leave Golden State for Philadelphia. I like my fit there, which is a possibility. Not a big one, but a possibility. A sign and trade involving Klay Smith for Fultz, Zaire Smith, and TJ McConnell. That way, Golden State at least gets some type of
point guards.
Is Zaire Smith? Is he a point guard or shooting guard?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's a point guard. I mean, maybe he's like a
combo guard. And again, I mean, you're losing Klay Thompson, but at least you're getting something back. I'm not saying this is a good deal for Golden State, but if Klay Thompson agrees to go, why not Golden State say, hey, you know what? We're still shedding some salary here because again, sign and trade rules are pretty complicated, especially involving a player like Klay Thompson. But essentially, Golden State